Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in the philosophy of death. This topic is going to be the first of our major substantive conversations relating to this subject, and we're going to begin by thinking about the metaphysical perspectives on death. Within that topic, we will begin by thinking about physicalism or materialism and the end of consciousness. So, essentially, materialism, often referred to as physicalism, especially within more modern philosophy, is the metaphysical position that holds that everything that exists is fundamentally made of matter, and that all phenomenon, including that of consciousness, are all the result of physical processes. And so, according to this materialistic approach to reality, the mind, the consciousness, and personal identity are not separate from the body, but are dependent on the functioning of the brain and other physical processes. And so with that in mind, what we're going to do is talk about the idea of materialism and the assertion of materialism and how this relates to a unique perspective on the philosophy of death. So materialism asserts two major concepts. Physicalism specifically, I'll start referring to it more as physicalism. Physicalism refers to two main, or asserts two main basic tenets. The first is this idea that everything is physical. There is no distinction between the mental and physical realms. All experiences, or thoughts, or emotions, or mental states are ultimately the result of physical processes that occur within the brain and the body. What this means is that there is no need for a non-physical identity, so a non-physical soul, or the idea of the mind, because everything can just be explained in terms of brain activity, in terms of neurotransmitters, in terms of neural interactions. Everything can just be explained through the physical processes. The second key assertion is that the idea of consciousness is a concept that emerges out of that of the brain. So consciousness, self-awareness, and subjective experiences, often sort of collectively referred to as qualia, are the result of complex interactions of neurons, molecules, electrical signals, all within the brain. To take the sort of dualist perspective, there is no, quote, ghost in the machine. There is no immaterial essence that accounts for consciousness. There is no ethereal concept that is separate to the body that we can collectively describe as the mind or our consciousness. It is an emergent property of physical systems. This idea of it being an emergent property is sometimes known as emergentism, and it is a subset of materialistic philosophy, which holds that the consciousness arises from the brain, but it is not reducible to simple physical processes. So there are different considerations to be had within various different approaches from physicalism. For those of you who are following along my series on the philosophy of mind, you will know about physicalism in quite a lot of detail. We spoke and have spoken about identity theory, and we'll be speaking about functionalism and how these things relate to dualist theories such as substance dualism and Cartesian and predicate dualism and all these different kinds of things. So, like I mentioned in the previous lesson, the philosophy of death is a multidisciplinary subject. It involves a conversation about metaphysics and about the philosophy of mind, all of which are subjects that we have covered already as their own separate dedicated series on the Philosophy Academy. So bear that in mind if you want to know more about these ideas. So that's what materialism tells us. And so from a materialist perspective, the idea of death is understood to be the termination of biological processes, as we defined it in the previous lesson. And these are the biological processes that sustain the brain and the body. Once these processes cease to continue, consciousness, which is intimately tied to the physical functioning of the brain, also ceases to continue, also ceases to take place. And this gives rise to several implications. So one of the implications is that consciousness is therefore dependent on the brain. According to materialism, consciousness cannot exist without a functioning brain. This is because, in this view, the mind and the body are inseparable. Consciousness is not a separate entity, but a result of the brain's electrochemical activities. And so when the brain stops working at the point at which somebody dies, the processes that give rise to these ideas of consciousness also stop working. They also cease. And there is no longer any kind of subjective qualia. There is no subjective conscious experience. There is no subjective awareness or continuity of the self. This is what happens at the point of death, according to a materialist. There is also the cessation of personal identity. From a physicalist standpoint, personal identity, your personhood, is also tied to your brain and physical activity and your physical body. And so the result of that means that when a person was to die, their body decomposes, their brain ceases to function. And so according to the materialist perspective, the personal identity, the concept of personhood, also ceases to exist. There is no self that persists after death, as self is simply the sum of the mental and the physical processes which occur within the body. Death marks the final end of the individual. There is no continuation of consciousness. There is no continuation of identity beyond the point at which people have died. And so we can understand death on a physicalist perspective, from a materialist perspective, as the end of experience. Death is viewed as the absolute cessation of experience. There is no afterlife. There is no continued awareness. There is no reincarnation. Since materialism posits that consciousness is tied to physical processes within the body, once those processes stop, which we are fairly confident that that's what happens when people die, we can at least conclude that that is the case, then so too does the idea of the subjective conscious experience. And so this perspective suggests that essentially death is not something that people should fear, since it marks the end of a person's existence, a person's experience, the cessation of their subjective experience. And so in essence, death is seen as the return to the state of non-existence. And so in the same sense that you don't experience what it was like to be around in the 1800s, you don't experience what it's like to exist after you are dead. And it is similar in the same way. It's like I don't have any feelings towards not being around prior to my birth. But at the same time, that therefore means that when I die, that same kind of experience, that same kind of feeling is there. There shouldn't be any kind of feeling beyond that of death, if that makes sense. Hence why people say that from this materialist, physicalist perspective, there is a certain sense of comfort in relation to thinking about death, that it's not something to fear because it is simply the cessation of experience. Now, of course, as we know, and as you would know if you've watched my lessons on the philosophy of mind, the idea of physicalism or materialism is closely tied to and closely linked to the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is, of course, a central philosophical issue, and it concerns the relationship between the mind or the consciousness and the body, the brain. Now, the mind-body problem simply asks a very basic question. How can a physical brain give rise to non-physical mental experiences such as thoughts, feelings, and self-awareness? Now, there are three major physicalist theories that I'm going to explain here, two of which, of course, I've already explored in the philosophy of mind in more detail, but I'm going to just summarize here for you right now. So the first of these is the identity theory, sometimes known as mind-brain identity theory. An identity theory simply holds that mental states are identical to physical states in the brain. So, in other words, when we experience something mentally, there is a corresponding physical state that takes place in the brain. So, if I were to experience pain, I were to stub my toe and experience pain, then the brain will register this sensation through specific neural firing patterns, specifically C fibers. Now, according to identity theory, then, there is no need for there to be this idea of a separate and immaterial mind that is beyond that of the body. The mind is simply the brain in action. It is one and the same thing. And so from this perspective, when we apply this to the philosophy of death, death is the end of these neural processes, and so with it is the end of our consciousness and our self-awareness. Functionalism is similar, and it's also a physicalist theory, but it's also one that sort of looks to finding some of the problems with identity theory and try to solve some of those problems. And so basically what functionalism tells us is that mental states can be defined by their functional roles rather than by their underlying physical constitution. What do I mean by this? Well, according to functionalism, a mental state, such as believing something, or desiring something, or having perception of something, is identified by the role that it plays in a particular system, rather than the specific physical processes that are involved in that experience. What this does is it allows for the possibility that consciousness can be realized in different physical systems. And this is one of the major problems that identity theory has. It's sometimes known as the problem of multiple realizability. The idea here being that if the experience of pain, let's say, the mental state pain, is just identical to the brain state pain, the physical processes that goes on in the brain, then how can we explain the fact that you have multiple different species across all of the biological spectrum that have all kinds of different brains and the way brains are made and how they evolve? They're all completely different, but they all seem to have and share this experience of pain. How is it that pain can be sort of viewed as consistent across all of these species, whereas the brain states are not the same? You could even say that a computer, an artificial intelligence, if an artificial intelligence starts to experience mental states, like experience pain, how can we explain that in the same way as we explain pain in biological systems? Well, what functionalism does is it allows for this concept, because what it does is it allows the possibility that consciousness can be multiply realized in different physical systems. So it can be realized by a reference to its function in a artificial intelligence, or in the brain of an octopus, or in the brain of an alien that has completely different biologies to ours. Now, this is still nevertheless the case that functionalism still implies that consciousness requires a functioning physical system, so it is still a physicalist theory. And so when we apply this to the philosophy of death, when the brain ceases to function at the point at which somebody dies, the mind or the consciousness ceases to operate as well. And then finally, as mentioned earlier, the idea of emergentism is a form of physicalist materialist theory which suggests that consciousness emerges from the complex interactions of simpler physical processes. So consciousness on this account is not a fundamental feature of the universe. It's not like matter or energy, for example, or space and time, but instead it is a product of the brain's structure and the brain's function. According to this view, consciousness is a higher order phenomenon that arises when the brain reaches a certain level of complexity. So as the brain develops and as the brain starts to become further and further complex, and the rising complexity continues, at some point in this process, the idea of consciousness and the idea of a subjective conscious experience emerges. When the brain stops functioning at death, then, this consciousness dissipates, this consciousness ceases to exist. And so the emergentists argue that this explains why death marks the end of consciousness, because it is the complex emergent property of a functioning brain. A functioning brain. When somebody dies, their brain seemingly, unless they get, they have damage to the brain that's caused that death, but their brain is physically, at least, in a generally functioning way, in a generally functioning order. Maybe it's not working anymore. There's no electrical impulses taking place, but at least it is the same in terms of its physical structure as when you were alive. But it is the fact that it is a functioning brain that is required for an emergentist to say that consciousness exists. So when the brain ceases to function, this is the marks the end of consciousness. So all of these are very interesting and very impactful responses to and ideas relating to what it means from a metaphysical perspective to actually die, to actually come to the end of somebody's life. Well, what are the challenges and responses that we can think of in relation to this? Well, particularly with regard to the subjective nature of consciousness, there are definitely issues relating to materialism. And the first part of this is the hard problem of consciousness, as coined by philosopher David Chalmers. Essentially, Chalmers's hard problem of consciousness suggests that the subjective experience of being conscious, i.e. the idea of what it is like to be a person, cannot ever be fully explained by physical processes alone. In other words, what I'm saying here is that understanding the brain's neural activity doesn't necessarily tell us why we have experience or why these experiences feel the way that they do. And so some critics of materialism argue that this indicates that consciousness cannot ever be seen as a purely physical concept, a purely physical process, and so that there must be some aspects of consciousness that transcends the physical brain. And if that is the case, then there could be some aspects of consciousness that transcends the point at which somebody, biologically at least, dies and ceases to exist. Now, the materialist might attempt to address the hard problem of consciousness by suggesting that the subjective nature of experience would potentially be eventually able to be explained by advances in neuroscience. Now, in my opinion, this is a little bit of a cop-out, because essentially what this is saying is we will come up with the answer, us materialists, we will come up with the answer to the hard problem of consciousness. We have to wait till science finds it for us, essentially. I don't find this particularly convincing, but I'm going to continue at least anyway, talking about this particular perspective. So a materialist might propose that consciousness is a complex phenomenon that arises from physical processes that we don't yet fully understand, and that that we can explain it in purely physical terms, potentially with further research. So on this view, there's no need for essentially seeing that the hard problem of consciousness is indeed a hard problem and going, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this problem? Well, let's divert away from materialism and let's see if we can find an explanation that requires an aspect of consciousness that transcends the brain. Well, a materialist might say, well, hold fire a second. Let's just wait until further research can come up with an answer to that question. It's not necessarily the case, some people argue that it is, but it's not necessarily the case that the hard problem of consciousness means that there could never be an explanation that is physical, potentially at least anyway, but that there isn't right now an explanation that is physical. And so on this view, there is no need for non-physical explanations of consciousness, according to a materialist. It is simply a matter of just uncovering the right physical mechanisms associated that can answer these questions. There are also, obviously, critics from dualism, and we'll get to dualism in a future lesson, but while materialism faces difficulties explaining the idea of consciousness, it is still often considered to be a more scientifically grounded position than that of dualism. Dualism is positing the view that, in fact, the mind is, in fact, separate to that of the body and that of the brain. And so materialists argue that dualism faces its own set of problems. So, for example, as we'll get to in future lessons, dualism is particularly difficult or faces the problem of trying to explain how a non-physical mind or soul has the ability to interact with the physical brain. It's the interaction problem. But if the mind is separate from the body, how does it influence brain activity, which in turn affects thoughts, actions, and feelings? That is a question for dualists. But therefore, materialists argue that dualism introduces a certain degree of unnecessary complexity to the question, and so as a result of which it is more parsimonious, it is more easily to explain the idea of consciousness through a physicalist perspective. Finally then, I just want to think about this with reference specifically to death, given that this is the philosophy of death that we're talking about. So materialist views on death do have implications for how we understand and how we react with the idea of mortality. Because since materialism suggests that death is the true end of consciousness, it may lead to more people accepting or being more indifferent to their attitudes towards death. It implies that death marks the cessation of personal experience, rather than some transition to another form of existence. Now, this could invoke numerous responses. It could invoke a fear of death, the finality of death, because for a materialist, death is final. There is no continuation of consciousness. There's no afterlife. There's no reincarnation. This view may reduce the fear of, on the one hand, of posthumous suffering, i.e., the idea of suffering after you die, which is on the one hand a good thing. If you live in fear that you might go to hell because you have a particular religious belief, then a materialist or a physicalist perspective might definitely help to alleviate that fear. But also it may contribute to an existential anxiety towards the point at which death happens itself, because the idea that death is the end of everything can be very unsettling. Because if you believe that is the case, then you can't rely on any comfort in an afterlife or anything like that. And this is the case especially if one believes that consciousness is the core of personal identity. The idea of your personal identity ceasing to exist is particularly existentially difficult to deal with, and is something that unfortunately we will all have to deal with at some point in the future, which is a very scary thing of existential anxiety that we can all sit around around the computer looking at these lessons and experiencing for ourselves. This is more of a therapy series than anything else for us all who are experiencing an existential crisis when it comes to the face of mortality in the face of death. So bearing that in mind, that's why I'm making these lessons. With all this in mind then, some materialists might argue that knowing that death is the end of consciousness can provide a sense of urgency to live in a way that is meaningful. Since life is finite, it becomes more precious, and individuals are encouraged to make the most of their limited time on this earth, being creative, finding meaning, and thinking about meaning, and thinking about doing things. This aligns with some of the views of existentialist philosophers, such as Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, who both suggest that facing the reality of death can help us live with a certain sense of authenticity. And we'll get to that in future lessons' time, but this can be quite comforting in a way. Knowing that death is the end is a thing that makes us realize what we have, and makes us realize how much we have and how much we don't have, and then therefore how much we should be spending our time doing things that are meaningful, doing things that are productive, doing things that contribute good to the world and contribute good to others, or just living a life that you are happy with living, finding meaning in yourself regardless of how this meaning is expressed, what this meaning actually is. And that's a kind of wise way of thinking about the materialism perspective of consciousness, and how this could relate to the finality of death. So to just sort of conclude this lesson then, we've sort of gone on a bit of an emotional roller coaster. I feel like every single one of these lessons will be very similar. But essentially, in materialism, the end of consciousness is tied directly to the cessation of physical processes in the brain. The idea of consciousness and personal identity and self-awareness are all seen as the results of physical activity, and once this activity ceases at the point at which somebody dies, there is no continuation of the self. This can have a particularly impactful perspective on the ways in which this contributes to how somebody may or may not live their life in the face of mortality, but it can also contribute to existential anxiety in the sense that presenting death as the point at which nothing else will take place, you can cease to exist as a person, can be quite a scary and challenging thought. The next lesson we'll think about the concept of dualism and the idea of a body and a soul, and the perspective that death might not be the end according to that theory, and how this can contribute to some more some lesser anxieties, at least about death itself, but some anxieties about the concept of living a life in order to be able to align with the spiritual or religious values of your particular chosen faith.